So, $10.77. You think you'd pay that for a copy of my fantasy adventure novel, Song of Mornius? Because you might get two. I've decided to publish the book through Amazon and Kindle. And that way people who want printed copies can request printed copies, or they can get them as an ebook on Kindle, which I don't know if that would, I think that might be a less expensive way to go. I would probably be using the template for the cover that Amazon provides, but I do have one person who indicated that he might be able to do some cover art for me. So anyway, I'm in the process of putting Mornius up on Amazon and Kindle as a self-published work. And I'm hoping down the road maybe a traditional publisher might pick it up. I've heard that that does sometimes happen. But as a first-time novelist, this would be my first book. It's very hard to publish a first book. And my incentive to doing it this way, basically taking the shortcut, my mom is 91 years old. She has dementia. She is not, I don't know how much longer she's going to be aware of anything. I really want my mom to know that I published before she dies. I want her to, it's an old thing of mine where I've always wanted to make my mom proud of me. And I've procrastinated, I've gone through depression, I've put it to the side, I've put it off. Well, I lost my creativity while I was going through depression. I had zero creativity, so it just sat there. And now my mom isn't the person she used to be. I don't know how much of her is even in there anymore. But I would love nothing more than to hand her a copy of Song of Mornius and put it in her hands. And I'm using my pen name. The pen name I'm using will be my maiden name, not my married name. Because if I get married down the road, then I won't be Diane Fadden anymore. I'll be something else. But I will always be my dad's daughter. So I'm going with my maiden name, Steinbach, which sounds like a writer's name anyway, for my pen name. So I just want to put that out there that hopefully very soon, I'm not sure how long it's going to take, maybe a couple more days, I will be posting a link to how you can get a copy of Mornius. I actually did go through it and proofread it and edited it. So hopefully it will read like a polished novel. I mean, I've rewritten it many times. With the exception of the later chapters, but I think it works, and I think it's time, and now I'll be able to move on and write the sequels, and that's the other reason I wanted to do this, so I could put it behind me and write the sequels. So without further ado, I wanted to read the last chapter of Song of Mornius that I did finally write. And for those of you who remember the chapters, otherwise you might have to go back and kind of look at them or listen to them, because I have every one of the chapters on YouTube. I read them aloud. There's a playlist called Song of Mornius on my channel with all 51 now, as of today, all 51 chapters being read by myself, trying to read them as well as I can. So if you haven't listened to them, or if you haven't, it's been a while, you might want to go back and kind of listen to the last one or the last two, so you remember what happened before chapter 51, because it's been a long time since the last chapter. Okay, so here it is. Chapter 51, Song of Mornius. Caught fast by alien magic's whirling might, Galen ignored the myriad of times and places spangling across his vision, the remnants of Pony's ruined crystal. Instead he focused on the point of Hallrum's upward thrust, the velvet black carpet spreading before him, clouds pulling back, dissolving into nothingness in his wake. He felt the tearing in his chest as Halram broke from him at last, abandoned him for freedom, leaving behind a final tang of the warder's regret in his mouth. Regret, perhaps, for his death? Galen pondered this numbly, for he was fading fast, his consciousness fraying like the roiling white vapor far below. Vaguely he felt himself tumbling end over end, a feather in a freezing void, his gaping mouth yearning for breath, arms stretched to the blue sphere rising to meet him in the narrowing sliver of his sight. In some distant way he felt Warder's fire like he had never felt it before, strong and beyond ancient, fully refined and wholly mastered, spinning protectively round him from above. A whirling gray and white funnel raised in response, whipping the clouds below to a frenzy, a twisting spout of furious winds, pale lightning licking through its core. Arms flailing, Galen plunged straight down through its heart, through its eye of eerie stillness toward a circle of glittering blue far below. Gently now he fell, buffeted by currents tossing him this way or that, up again, then down, and side to side. He fell long enough to feel his body return to life, the numbness fading until his skin felt the wind. Above his head he glimpsed the edges of the sky limed with fire, heard thunder rolling to form sound, a voice that could only be Sephram's, Talankai's warder, speaking one word, "Save!" Galen fell toward the growing patch of blue through the storm, imagining himself a bird freed at last, unfettered from fletches or bars. Something floated small in the waters far below him. He could see it now, growing swiftly in size as he approached. A ship, he realized, a very large ship, shaped like the blade of a sword. Tarek? Felrina stepped in as close as she dared, following his troubled gaze to a sky that, after days underground, seemed dazzling bright. He stood rigid in the shallow snow under the arms of the naked trees, tears sliding down his face. It was as if he could still see the winged elf somehow, though Pony had vanished with Avalar several hours ago. With a shiver he snatched a breath, lowered his head and scrubbed at his mouth. "I hear you," he said finally, and now he stared at his snow-covered feet. "There's nothing for it." Eyes bleak, he turned to face her, his breath pluming in the sunlight. She met his warm hazel eyes as his hands reached to brush snow from her shoulders. "Nothing for what?" she whispered. Pain tightened her throat until his visage swam before her. "The Shan never left," he noted again, peering over her head at the stout little beast Fjörgen prepared for the trip back. "Kildoran said they'd—" Looking up, Felrina watched him as his brow furrowed. "Return at the end," he finished. Such an interesting way to phrase it. I assumed he meant they'd head back for home. "Lucky for us you were wrong," she told him. She pressed her cheek against the hard, smooth coldness of his leather breastplate. "Maybe they knew something we didn't." She smiled at the thrum of his heartbeat beneath her fingers, the smell of leather and dirt. "Where do we go from here, Tarek?" she asked him finally, though she dreaded his response. "What's to become of me? Am I—" She swallowed. "To be imprisoned?" At the feathery touch of his fingers along her temple, she closed her eyes. "A human court would sentence you to death for what you've done," she heard him breathe above her head. "And so you were, weren't you? Put to death. You remember?" Her breath was shaky as she exhaled. "My neck's still sore," she said with a nod. As his soothing touch drifted to knead the muscles under her skull, she watched a squirrel leap to perch on a stump close by, saw its black liquid eyes blink at the brightness of the sun as it flicked its fancy tail. She smiled at its antics and the hope it gave her of spring. "Pony and I discussed this before he took Avalar home," Tarek said. "Since this involved magic unnatural to humans, he feels that you and your peers were manipulated by Malian. You should be taken to Meredith, to the Seeker Elves. He suspects the elves will view you as wounded, Filrina. Likely they'll heal whatever damage they find in you and then send you home." Filrina nodded against his chest. "That doesn't seem fair," she said after a pause. "As you said, we committed crimes against humanity. I don't want to think how many I killed. If any of my people from Kitterin see me—" "Come home with us, Filrina. Myself and Roth, Virgen," Terex said through her fear. "Veilhorse could use your skills as a rider and trainer. We pay well, and you'd be given shelter. Ask Virgen. My father expects hard work from his people, but his manner is fair. He would— Yes, I'll come." Stepping back, Filrina grinned through sudden tears at the watery blur of his face. "If it means I'm near you, Terek, I'll come with you. I'll go anywhere, but I don't know why you'd—" She closed her eyes as his hands reached from the smudged silhouette of his form veiled by sunlight. His fingers cupped her face, lifted her head, gently thumbed aside her tears. She gasped when he leaned down swiftly and kissed her. Helpless then, she was sobbing, for his lips were so familiar, evoking a much happier time, the girl she used to be. "Hush," he admonished softly, stepping back. "That was long overdue," he added, smiling. She nodded while his arm drew her tightly to his side and walked her toward the littlest Shan. In one fluid movement, one flex of his muscles, she was lifted onto the saddle of the colorful little beast. She saw Virgen was mounted beside her and to the front, his expression as he looked back filled with gladness for her, with twinges of disdain for the dumpy creature he sat upon. Even mounted, she still looked up a bit to meet Terek's quiet regard. He, too, was smiling, his hazel eyes glinting reflections of the sun. "That's in the past, Rena," he told her finally. Then he nodded and accepted the reins Lieutenant Roth placed in his hand. "Let's go home," he said, his words addressing them all, Virgen and Roth, Dren Avram and herself, yet Filrina noticed how his gaze never once strayed from her face. Avalar blinked, another vain attempt to clear her sight. The tableau on the shelf above her head seemed frozen in time, unwavering as she approached. Thresher Guvorian, under layers of filth from years of endless toil, knelt in a patch of unnatural light, heavily chained over a thick, bloodied post. What was behind him other than darkness she did not know, but she heard the repeated whistle and crack, saw the blood splatter as the 4 steel balls tore through his flesh. As the legendary leader of her people flinched and ducked his grizzled head, Avalar heard the mocking laughter of humans behind him, too cowardly to be seen. Never had she beheld Leader Trenter's father, except in the many paintings and drawings at Freedom Hall, yet now here he was, well in his prime, laced head to foot with jagged scars. Shaking from her unexpected transition and the crackle of Pony's magic still dancing on her skin, Avalar focused on him to anchor her thoughts. With gritted teeth, she hunkered low behind a jutting stalagmite, straining to get a better view. "I am in our past," Avalar thought with dismay. "This." She looked down at the sword in her hands. "His sword has brought me here." At the sight of his suffering, she could not stay hidden long. Compelled by the repeated cracking of the lash, Avalar moved at her lowest possible crouch up the darkened grade to kneel under the post running slick with his blood. Reaching up, she gently stroked his contorted wrist with trembling fingers. Then, as soundlessly as she could, she worked the black sword's tip between where one link came together. With a single hard turn of her arm, she pried it apart. He did not feel her touch or see her at all, yet his pain-glazed eyes lifted at the faint vibration of the chain behind the post. In those brittle gray eyes she saw fear and suspicion spark, then slowly ebb, giving way to hope as she quietly separated the links, lowering the two ends of the massive chain to the ground. "You're free," she whispered as she slid the black sword through the mine's black glittering dust to his side. His head jerked sideways. He could hear her. "Fight, great leader," she breathed fiercely. "The sword's right beside your leg. See it. Free our people." No giant had ever known how Gavorian had come by his weapon. He had stayed behind when the elfin ship finally came, for its size could not accommodate so many giants as there were. So he, like many other sires and grandsires, had surrendered his place to their children and mothers. By the time the next ship came a 9th day later, no one remained on the icy sand waiting, and all of Hathra's giants grieved their loss. All they had left was their legend, so very often told, that the sword appeared to their leader at a time of great extremity, sparking the rebellion in his heart that had saved them all. "This is how," Avalar heard herself say aloud as she watched his big hand feel through the dust to seize the sword hilt. "He found it because of us. Galen, Pony." She shook her head as she opened her eyes to her father and leader Trenter, peering at her from across the great hall's black granite table. "Tarek and I," she whispered. "It sang to me when I was little, and I never could forget." "That is all you remember?" Leader Trenter asked her softly, and after a pause she shook her head, her gaze shifting to the canvas on stilts a youngster had set up beside them. As she watched the artist labor over the canvas, she saw his fine brush mirroring her vision, recreating Thresher's ordeal with loving touches of very expensive flax oil paint. "There was more," she said at the youth's hopeful glance her way. Again she closed her eyes. In her mind's eye she watched how Thresher's tortured body gathered itself, how he clambered to his feet behind the post, his huge back and shoulders spraying blood as he whirled in his chains to face his tormentors, the great sword clenched in his hands. "I heard him cry out," she whispered fiercely. His voice was like thunder. He was so angry. "I saw him charging at them. Then, that's when I found her." Pony entered the hall through the arched crystal doorway and stopped when the 5 giants glanced toward him. "I found her and brought her back," he said. "Thresher never saw her master first. He saw the sword, that is all. Nothing has been harmed by her journey to that time." "Now the sword is back here at Freedom Hall?" Avalar shook off the painful cobwebs of her memory and glanced toward her father, and Cameron standing behind him bearing the human face she loved. Slowly Grevelin nodded. "It lies upstairs on its blanket of furs. As far as we know, it never left us, Avalar." "So Tarek and the others live?" Avalar focused past her father to Cameron, gazing steadily back, his sparkling brown eyes filled with pride for her. Cameron nodded. He was larger than her father, Avalar noted, outstrapping even her Uncle Kurgan Rock. There was something new in his expression, too, she realized, studying his face, a new intensity whenever he looked her way. "Safe and sound. Your eyes weren't playing tricks, I assure you," Cameron told her with a smile, his human voice not yet matching his size. "Tarek plans to journey back to Tirdan, exchange the Shan for their horses, and then continue on." Avalar nodded slowly. She stared down at the table between her folded hands until tears blurred out her sight. "But not Galen," she whispered. "He never—" "No," said Pony from the doorway. "He gave himself up for our future, Avalar. When you winked out, so did he, and now Talankai is free. Malian's dead, Homerum's gone. All that remains on Talankai is your natural magic." After a tense pause, Pony added quietly, as if he risked much bringing it up, "And my own?" "Human magic, too," sang a piping voice, breaking the tension, and Avalar smiled to see a very familiar little human skip into the room. "Cray?" Stunned, she glanced open-mouthed at the winged elf. "This is the child you have been caring for? The one I rescued?" "Indeed." Pony grinned into her astonishment as the little boy dashed to the table and proceeded at once to climb his way up Grevelin's leg. "He's not in my care any more, though," he told her gently. "Your father knows a great deal more about raising children than I do. He has agreed to let Cray stay here, for the time being, until he's older." Avalar looked from one face to the next around the table. Everything seemed to be falling into place except for one thing, and that was her future. She found herself meeting Leader Trenter's scrutiny. Of all of them, only he seemed to perceive her thoughts, her dilemma. She was right back where she started, on Hathra Isle, after months of tasting freedom and learning the sword's lore. Her father Grevelin had promised to make her a new sword, but whatever would she do with it here? Avalar. Trenter's eyes were thoughtful as he turned slowly in his chair to face her. "You have done well representing our people in a hostile land. There will be a feast tonight in the courtyard in your honor, celebrating the girl who delivered the sword to set us all free. But I see now restlessness in you, a desire to... I just want more." She cut him off, then immediately winced at her own rudeness. "I am sorry, Father," she said to Grevelin. "Leader Trenter, I have gained much skill with my weapon. I have striven very hard to—" "I hope," Trenter broke in, "soon we may scout the land where our people once lived. Pony assures me the slavers are gone. I therefore believe the time has come for giants to venture out. If the elves will allow it, I wish to send a small sampling of our people to set up a farm in the south, restart our grain crops." Slowly Avalar nodded, watching his face. "Shirkan raiders threaten us whenever we sail to the south. They are fierce pirates, Avalar, a greater danger by far than our foes in the north. I will need strong warriors to protect our ships and the giants who cross that land. Would you volunteer?" "I would," Cameron said at once from his place behind her father. "But someone needs to teach me to fight and use a sword." Meeting Cameron's hopeful stare, Avalar nodded slowly. "I will teach you," she told him. She looked again at her leader, considered the chance at freedom he gave her. "Yes, I would go, if my father will allow—" "Ha!" Grevelin barked a laugh, peering down at her over the little human on his lap. "Like I could stop you?" he snorted at her look. Avalar, flicking her gaze around the massive, crystalline room, opened her mouth to answer, but the look on Pony's face stopped her. The winged elf still stood near the main doorway. It was her uncle Kurganrock who had ventured quietly into the room behind him and now bent whispering close to his ear. What he said she did not hear, but the expression of surprised relief and sudden joy crossing the elf mage's face. She leaped to her feet so fast her stone chair flew back with a crash and split in two. Ignoring Cameron and Grevelin rising to stop her with their hands, she broke from them all and hurried toward the elf. "What is it, Uncle?" she cried. "Pony, what?" Pony pursed his lips, trying to look serious, but as he looked deliberately past her to Trenter, his grin returned. "Leader Trenter," he said formally, "I am saddened to report you now have another human on Hathra Isle." "Galen!" Avalar gasped. Then she was sprinting, out from Freedom Hall, down the icy steps, then over the creaky wooden bridges toward the rocky shore. Tiny granules of icy snow pelted at her face, but she didn't care. Ahead were the blurry gray line of the docks, darker smudges against the murky gray shoreline, and there, floating serenely at the end of the only pier close enough to be in focus, Dawncutter, her uncle's ship. A slight figure was walking toward her in baggy, oversized clothing, far too small to be a giant. Yet that sideways turn of the mouth, the rust-colored hair whipping forward in the wind. He held no staff, yet she knew him at once. Without hesitation, she vaulted onto the pier and rushed to her friend. "You are alive!" Dropping down to kneel before him, she enfolded him wholly in her arms. Galen Laval! She shook her head, dashing tears from her face with the back of her hands. How? She managed. He took you into the sky. Tarek saw you flying. Galen stepped back, smiling. Then his hands found her face, stroked her forehead, his fingers tracing the soft curve of her eyebrows. Well, he said wryly, peering deep into her eyes, I guess I'm not done living yet. Haram knew it better than I did. At her puzzled expression, he patted her forearm and grinned. I'm going to accept Tarek's offer. She cocked her head, straining to see him clearly through the spiraling white flurry gathering around them both. What offer? I do not recall. She saw a different Galen now, standing tall and strong before her. She watched him toss his chin with a steely confidence she had never seen before. In amazement, she felt herself grinning back. His eyes sparkled as his gaze reclaimed hers, determined and happy. Tarek promised me, Avalar, to teach me to ride horses.